Bonjour. Alors, très
Hello. Good afternoon. Very happy, very pleased to tackle this topic in 45 minutes. So what's green growth for developing countries? In other words, the impact transition in poor or developing countries. The participants in this roundtable are quite impressive, consultants. Now, to kick it off, give the floor to Mrs. Djoufelkit. I'm not sure that the pronunciation is right. No, it's quite all right. You represent the French Development Agency, the main operator of aid to development in France, which has gone up, increased a lot. It has, it's the budget that's increased most in France. Not so much this year, but it's a massive policy on the part of France. To deal with the green economy, you decided you wouldn't fund fossil energies anymore, in whether you're representing the developing countries. So you need a research department. You are in contact, in touch with local government on green issues. What about this claim on the part of richer countries to do more in favor of developing countries? Well, thank you very much. Very happy to be with you. The AFD has really engaged in this project about 10 years ago. In our department, we support South Hemisphere countries, Global South. Everything I'm going to say from now has to do with green growth. How can you continue bring prosperity by protecting nature in order to act in favor of global well-being? And this is a definition. It means that there has to be some uncoupling. I don't like the word. It tends to be, it's an ambitious agenda, decoupling on consumption and production. Very few countries achieve this. Some do it. Some developed countries achieve this. They rely on technologies, and therefore they can do it. But in the global south, it's a different situation. My first point would be the growth of green growth in the global south cannot be the same as in the north. In developed countries, they must comply with the sobriety objective. Transition is an absolute must because these countries are very much impacted by the climate change, both from the strictly climatic point of view, diversity, species. I don't give you any figures, but global south countries show that they feel the worst impact of global warming and climate change. Well, I need to insist on the fact that there's difference. This is what they call DDD, trajectoire de développement durable, because it's based on 3 pillars. Essentially, pillar 1 is energy transition, decarbonation, which is based on energy. Essentially, second is innovation to increase the use made of materials. And number 3 is structural transformation, getting specialized in a green product, switching from a carbon-based economy to green products. And this depends on the condition that prevail in each individual country. Now you have to add to this the social impact. Growth must be a source of redistribution. This is really the convergence, global convergence trajectory. this is very often disconnected from our thinking process. We try to see this as a system where prosperity, environmental issues, and social issues cannot be separated from one another. So let's continue with the Sidy Diop. You as you're with the Deloitte, but at Deloitte, you're especially active in Africa on these issues. Many projects in Africa that we'll try to explain further on. Now, to start with, could you set the stage, as it were? I saw the figures you quote about CO2 emissions, something you need to keep in mind, 1.6 tons per inhabitant in Africa versus 37 tons in Europe. So you see the order of magnitude. It's really important to deal with ecology when you don't really have a big issue or emitter. Yes, this is part of what we do at Deloitte. We're fortunate in that we work in France and in French-speaking Africa, and we are indeed faced with this topic of growth and development and CO2 emissions. So this is the triptych I'd like to start with. So 3 pillars, 3 issues: growth, development, and CO2 emissions. Now, growth and development, of course, there's a link between those two, but there's no cause-to-effect relationship, as most African countries, sub-Saharan, have a positive growth rate, pretty high, 5%, higher than you might think. Now, for instance, RC, 5-6%, and yet it's one of the poorest countries worldwide. So it is quite a challenge. I'll be coming back to the strictly ecological challenge. So the link between growth and development can be challenged. To conclude on this first one, to achieve this causality, cause-effect regime, growth has to be high enough, 2 figures, 2 digits. It's not the case of most African countries. If you are below 10% growth, your population increases. Very difficult to have a link between growth and development. Now, second is where does growth come from? Where does it come from? Even though there's more and more diversification in African economies, you can't avoid the fact that growth is pulled by there's a very little leverage effect at local level. What do you make of this growth at local level? There's a lot to be done to improve the redistribution. So there is a link, of course, between CO2 emissions and development. A whole life is marked, impacted by economy. As to the last link or development and CO2 emission, as you rightly said, African countries say, well, as far as emissions is concerned, we are virtuous, 10 times lower than in Europe. So priority has to go to growth for development with the CO2 issue, but not if it has a negative impact on development. Now, let's use the indicator with the ratio is $50,000 per inhabitant. Priority is given to those people. But I'll be coming back to this and give you concrete examples. Growth cannot be achieved unless you take on board the necessary transition efforts. And this is what African countries are trying to do in 2 particular fields that are transport and energy. In Africa, these 2 sectors account for 35% of emissions, and a number of promising avenues that make it possible to control emissions on the energy mix and improved public transport. I'll leave it at that for now. So going a bit deeper, Stéphane Straub, you are an economist at TS in Toulouse, and you are seconded to the World Bank, and you are a specialist of infrastructures. It's interesting to see this because the needs for infrastructure in Africa are huge. I mean, transport in particular. What comes to mind first and foremost, you want to satisfy with the polluting transport means. Do you go for green growth or not? What about transport, the role of transport? Thank you for inviting me first. I'm very pleased to be with you. It's interesting to put this question in the context of growth. I joined the World Bank not very long ago. I was an academic until then. And when I first came, the bank has changed its motto. Had you visited the World Bank 2 years ago, it said in a hall, our dream is a world without any poverty. This is our main objectives. Half of the global population lives under the poverty line, which is $6.85 per day, and that's not much. And on top of this, we live in a situation where the pandemics has wreaked havoc. With the current growth rate, you can't get rid of poverty before the end of the century. That's one thing. The second, if you come to the bank, you'll see that our motto has changed. We have a new chairman. I wasn't there yet. Our dream is with a world without poverty in a livable planet. That takes on board the environment part of the equation. And this is the hedge because both are closely linked, and really you can't really offer a decent life out of poverty in a world that is not livable. But then it's extremely difficult to navigate this new situation. Second, I work in infrastructures, energy, transport, digital issues, water, sanitation. Well, the data are terrifying. So many millions of persons worldwide that have no access to water. No water, no running water, no sanitation. My mistake, billions, not millions, that have no access to internet, etc. And we're fully aware that high-quality growth cannot be generated unless you have access to electricity, no access to health institution. You can't get any educational training. So the challenge is, and this is your question, in fact, how you can generate growth. You invest in infrastructure in order to generate growth while complying with our climate objectives. Let's not, there's no such thing as a win-win situation. This is extremely difficult. You have to make choices. If you invest more, of course, you're bound to emit, to generate more emissions. You rightly said there's a decoupling, but it's a relative uncoupling. Means wealth increases, emissions do increase too, at a slow pace. But absolute decoupling would be to growing faster and seeing emissions go down. This is far from being the case. Some countries have this absolute decoupling, but they are few and far between. And the last challenge, which is not really often referred to, we could go for V's, decarbonization, so going for electricity, for transport, electrification is useful. And if that electricity is green, you're bound not to emit any CO2. But you tend to forget that in order to move around for that, you need roads. To build roads, you need cement or concrete. You need steel. To have a grid work, you need raw materials, and these raw materials are extremely CO2 intensive. If we were to build electrical networks in developing countries, as we did it in developed countries, US, France, etc., just building walls, building the groundworks, it would be in excess of our carbon budget. So it's a huge challenge to turn these industries into green solutions. There are a few solutions around, but they're extremely costly, and they haven't stood the economic financial test yet. I can stop here and then give you more details if needed. We continue with you, Nicolas Bourg. We're very happy, very pleased to have you with us because you are the president of Telecel. We want to know more about Telecel. It's a Pan-African group operator, telecom operator in these countries. Now, how do you perceive the problem of green growth on site? Is it a Western concept that doesn't really make any difference in African minds? And what do you do on site? Well, good afternoon to all. Yes, Telecel is a telecom operator active in Africa exclusively, is the leading telecom operator created in 1986. Now, we turned to ecology many years ago in all Telecel processes, but the telecom industry is a highly polluting industry. It is responsible for 3 to 4% of greenhouse gases emissions. So time has come to act. The good news is that there are solutions. You need to implement them. This is what we do at Telecel. And of course, there is this growing industry, economic growth that implies going for the digital economy in Africa. So it's absolutely huge in Africa. And the fact is that being aware of this issue is part of the dialectic between conscience and ecology. Anyway, we're tackling the problem, and we are trying hard to use 4 direct levers: solarization of our networks. For the past 2 years, on all Telecel networks, where it's taking some time, but we are solarizing 50% of the network that operates on the solar basis exclusively. This is a unique situation with 3 main consequences. The first one is that it is an example, it gives an example for other industry. If you use the sun and prove that infrastructure can work using nothing but solar energy, well, of course, it's bound to give ideas to other companies, other person, other people who are really have a growth as the main objective rather than green purpose. The second consequence is obvious: no emission, no carbon emission at all. Consequence number 3, which is interesting, you refer to electrification of population in Africa. Thanks to this mode of energy supply, you can plug in solar panels in rural regions on the grid, on the electricity grid directly. Going a step further, you can also erect solar panels in rural areas and use using your telephone and pay your energy by telephone. So you see, we are ready for this, let's call it energy change. Now, the second possibility is network sharing, creating a single telephone network that we would share. between operators of a country or territory. Why do we need to have one national grid? It doesn't make any much sense. It's polluting. It might be totally superfluous. There will be some redundancy. It's not required. Number three, 5 years ago, we created a startup fund, which is the largest in Africa. We've invested in 40 startups, healthy companies, and these startups are important to us because we incorporate digital economy in the concept, but also environment that is taken into account. So it's one of the criteria for the selection of the startup. We don't do this for a capitalistic outcome in order to protect the future, to create a socio-economic network, which is important in Africa. And to conclude, the telecommunications are crucial for developing countries to grow for two reasons, because this is really the basis, the pillar of digital economy, and also it enables us to educate populations, since we are the roads for information. Unless there's telecommunications there, we can't communicate. So I think we have an enormous role to play. Very interesting because it's very concrete. A number of things I've already achieved. Let's give the floor to the room. I don't see any hands raised as I'm talking to you, but I suppose you'll be willing or wishing to ask questions. What about the awareness of governments, African governments? You talk to governments of these countries. Do you think that they are aware of the need to start something new? There's a lot of everything is green growth speech. Is it really happening? What about green growth in global South countries? Yeah, it has become an obligation. It's a quasi-obligation. Africa can't go in the other direction compared with the rest of the world. We need financing, and the internal financing sources are not really present locally. So you can't ignore the climatic challenge when we fund a development plan project. Two concrete examples. Energy first. Some countries want to finance projects in the energy. It's much easier if it's a solar project or a hydro project as opposed to a coal project. There are no coal projects. If there is one, you can't possibly fund it using lenders or international lenders or local lenders. So it is an absolute obligation for African countries to act accordingly. Priority is given to development. That's the number one challenge. But it's very clear that they have the energy mix in mind. That percentage of energies, of techniques, different techniques in energy in sub-Saharan Africa is about halfway. Half of it is in the mix. Anyway, it's a promising mix. Not too bad, should I say. Technological innovation in the solar energy field have been grasped by African countries. The price of solar panels have gone down. Countries like Burkina Faso inaugurated plants, while it wasn't the case for many, many years. So things are changing. There are sources of financing and on technologies which are affordable and which actually integrating clean solutions in the energy mix. One last point on energy. when we discuss with the electricity company, there are none in French-speaking sub-Saharan Africa, none. I have an anecdote to tell you. We work with a company, and the CEO said he'd rather stop producing electricity because they won't get their money back. So you see, it's a huge challenge in the field of energy. As I said earlier, energy consumption in Africa is extremely low. Half the population has no access to it, to energy, and the per capita consumption is very low, 300 kilowatts per individuals. This is the equivalent of one refrigerator per year. So that's very small. In order to face this challenge, and the other one is profitability, we need to increase profitability because we're running a deficit. Thank you very much. Same question to you. You work for the bank development. What are you seeing? Yes, I feel a greater awareness. It's a fact the main impact or effect of climate change are felt in developing countries. One example, water stress is very significant in Maghreb countries, in South Africa. Rising sea level is an acute issue in Southeast Asia, so they don't have a choice. They must be aware of it because they are feeling it. They're hit first and foremost. Okay, noticing this, taking note of it is one thing. Now, making commitments is another. The real issue is the implementation nexus. Okay, you're saying we go for ecological transition. What do you tell to the population? You know, the population in this country is growing at a fast rate. What do you do in terms of creating jobs? How can you redirect productive structure that was depending on the export goods that were exported, or even very few green products? So there are structural issues. Financing is a problem too, and a lack of international cooperation. At some point, you have to make a way to local production that have to make progress in terms of a value chain, which requires a lot of cooperation. At a time when the U.S. Is implementing the IRA, Europe, the Red Act, Green Act. So, you know, everybody wants to be globally sovereign. So it really challenges us when it comes to the global South and North relationship. Stéphane Straub, what about demography? It's something that demography is still rampant, very high in most global South problems. How can you solve the situation?
It's an essential, crucial question. If you look at what electrification means for the people, 80% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa are, lacking electricity. Of course, there is real progress when it comes to the networking in terms of electricity. But what could we do? What can we do, rather? And there doesn't seem to be any direct, specific policy, and transition takes or doesn't take place. It depends. And I would like to go back what has just been said about one of the speakers. Of course, people on the continent are aware of the climate changes, are aware of climate change, of the climate challenges, but priority is trying to overcome poverty. Priority number one is not climate change. Let's be honest. Let's be aware of this. We did conduct. We did have what we call a BRT. That is to say, bus and solution. We did build, or we did design this initiative, bus plus tube, and thanks also to co-finance scheme with the European Bank, etc., with the World Bank, and it's getting started. It's fully electrified. It only operates electric buses, and of course it's more costly than what would have been merely normal buses. It entailed a real process, so people are fully aware of the challenges, but it all depends on the funding opportunities, possibilities, and quite interesting what you are seeing. It brings me to the next point. What about local practices? In farming, for instance, some of the practices are anti-environmental practices, and you are, if I remember well, you are conducting an initiative on what we call clean baking. Or clean cooking, because most people do use wood on the continent. So are there changes in such a practice? What about deforestation, which is highly detrimental? Is there any change in people's behaviors and attitude? Is there a shift? We hope so. But we are trying to support startups as much as possible in order to encourage less polluting cooking appliances, so to speak, or cooking facilities, let's say, rather, and some of these initiatives are really successful, but is it going to have a macroeconomic impact? It's too early to say. I'm sure it's going to take time in any case. But to go back to what you said concerning farming, we are in the same situation. I'm supporting another and monitoring another startup which uses sensors, water sensors, in order to better manage water consumption and to have less expensive production costs, and while being environmental friendly. So there is an awareness for sure. But and we have also to prove these people that by being kind of green, between inverted commas, or environmental friendly, you can produce better, more, and at a lesser cost. And Africa is ready to grow, is ready to expand. Population is booming, and Africa really wants to grow. It's up to industrialized countries to open an avenue and to avoid sharing our passing on our mistakes. We mustn't tell about the mistakes we made, just to tell them, please do avoid these mistakes. And the infrastructure issue is also pending and key issue. We work with institutions financing the various African states, and African states have to clearly understand that investments have to be made together with the private sector, because when funding is in the hands of governments only, it may be an issue, and investments may not reach the final consumer. So Who wants to answer the question concerning the example of Uganda? Well, it raises the issue of oil projects, oil companies' projects in Africa. Can you imagine environmental friendly oil projects, oil companies' projects? Well, green growth, that's good. But Africa is first and foremost looking for growth. Well, I tried to understand, to answer this question. We have worked on this topic when studying the impact on local economies. If you go back to the figures concerning the energy mix, CO2 emissions linked to transport are low compared to the rest of the world. And for things to happen in acceptable conditions, environmental speaking, I mean, we do need currency and proper use of the currency. And states want to bank on their resources, natural resources, I mean, and they're ready for that. But states are often fighting with their interlocutors because they really want to use their own resources to produce energy. And when it comes to emissions per inhabitant, the results are very good in Africa. Now, one update concerning demographic data. We just have 5 minutes left. If you look at the 25,000 square kilometers, and the African population, 1.1 billion inhabitants, is to be compared with the population on similar continents. So there isn't really an overpopulation. The real stake, the real challenge is the development of the country and of the populations. If we take on board current carbon emissions in Africa, I think they can go for the projects we just mentioned, that of oil companies. I'd like to go back to promises made by northern countries. We hear of thousands of promises. There have been agreements, international conferences, etc. What about the situation to date? Do you think you have kept all promises? Taking this 100 billion you just mentioned, I've read that was a few weeks or days ago that we were nearly there. But of course, we have to think of the nature of investment. If we make a promise, we have to stick to the promise. Otherwise, it will be detrimental to our projects, and we won't be credible any longer. But it takes time. Let's admit it. That's why we have to find alternative sources of financing. And our ambition at AFD, the ambition of our CEO, is to set up a coalition agreements with the state development banks, international ones too, and the private sector is also mandatory, quite essential, as I said before. And it's not that I don't really want to answer your question, but I think it's necessary to have a different model there isn't a good south model or north model, and I think there is a real need for homogenizing the sources of growth. But for this to be credible and feasible, as stated by all the speakers, a real challenge is the quality of the envisaged and planned and expected growth. And we have to ask ourselves, growth, yes, but what for? What about your opinion concerning these massive transfers? What has just been said is very, very interesting. We are the largest multilateral development bank, but is a drop in an ocean, needs being several thousands of trillions or billions. And what are we selling? What are we promising? Money to sustain, to support projects, and knowledge. Well, of course, I'm an academic and I do a lot of knowledge transfer. But I work on knowledge transfer. But what really matters is knowledge concerning project building, project structure, how to catalyze efforts, how to go ahead concerning the digital sector. The digital sector is highly innovative in this respect. It can largely reduce the emissions, carbon emissions in other sectors of activity. And we are still working on this, studying this. This is maybe very valuable. This transfer of knowledge has to be enhanced. Of course, it means working together with TSE, but other academic entities in order to make the appropriate decisions and to attract private money from the private sector. We don't always know which sectors are most profitable. For instance, in the sector of activity we are encouraging. So we are working on these topics, and it brings more added value than just adding $1 without working on knowledge transfer. You have your own view of the large-scale projects in the digital world. What about the return of experience on all this? What is your feedback? Well, there is in a nutshell, there is a lack of efficacy. There are large-scale projects, huge projects, large financing, but everything is being delayed, and it's very difficult to have a visibility on the outcome, and we don't really know where money is going to. And we are, you may be, of course, we have to work with large academic entities and MIT and others. We also have to work together with very efficient people. Otherwise, it's going we are going to fail. And I think there is a lack of efficacy and efficiency, and we have to change process in terms of financing these projects in these countries, on this continent. And we also have to set up, introduce new rules. Thanks very much indeed. It was quite interesting, very, very interesting debate.